All right, and let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do is, for those of you that have been on a live before, this is part four of kind of a series of lives that we're doing on the rules and regulations of private pilot. And so there's lots of them. So it's taken quite a few live lessons, and we'll probably have a couple more. Um, but what I do is kind of after each section, I'll take a break, I'll pause, and then I'll open up the chat and see if you guys have any questions. So if you have a question that comes to you, go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can wait till I say, all right, does anybody have questions? Up to you. But I do want to get to all your questions if you have them, but I'm just going to wait until I get done with the section or the subject, and then I'll answer them. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. Let's see here. All right, okay. So this is all we wanted to cover the private pilot rules and regulations. So in parts 1 through 3 of this live series, we've already covered all these things like categories, classes, and types of aircraft, certificates, other ratings and endorsements, pilot in command, pilot for hire. You guys can read, so I'm not going to list them all off. We also did airspeed limits, seatbelts and harnesses, and right away. Today we're going to focus on airworthiness. Now, it's kind of a lot, so I don't think in the hour we'll have enough time to cover airworthiness directives, so we might get to that next time. But we're going to do required documentation for aircraft, required inspections for aircraft, required equipment for aircraft, and inoperable equipment for aircraft. And then, as you can see, we still have quite a few more topics to cover. A lot of these are shorter though. Uh, they're kind of real short lessons, so they will go quicker. We can probably have just a couple live lessons remaining, maybe three, um, on this subject. So, anyways, so again, we're going to cover required documentation, required inspections, required equipment, and inoperable equipment. After each one, I'll open up the chat, see if you guys, have any questions. Required aircraft documentation. This is from FAR 91.203, Civil Aircraft Required Certificates and Documents. So, no person may operate a civil aircraft unless the following documents are within the aircraft. And we use the mnemonic ARROW. So, if you've been studying around, aviation training before, you've probably heard of this. It's an easy mnemonic to help remember the required documents. It's ARROW. It flows really well. It's an actual word, so it's a good one. So let's go over what each one of these is. So A of ARROW stands for Airworthiness Certificate. R stands for Registration Certificate. The second R stands for Radio Operator's License. The O stands for Operating Limitations, and the W stands for Weight and Balance. All right, so let's go over a little bit of each one of these and what you kind of need to know about them. So the first one is Airworthiness Certificate. Kind of have a sample picture of one here. It's good for the life of the aircraft as long as the required inspections and maintenance and airworthiness directives and things like that are kept up to date and performed. So as long as the other requirements are kept airworthy, the airworthiness certificate never really expires until the aircraft expires. All right, so the registration certificate. This is a little bit different than the airworthiness certificate. It's like a registration certificate for your aircraft. It kind of says who the aircraft belongs to. It's good for 7 years. It used to be good for 3 years, but they just changed it like this last year. So the FAA changed that from 3 years to 7 years, or if there's an ownership change. So, when you buy an aircraft from a dealer, they're going to change it from them to you, just like you would a car. Next one is the radio operator's license. This is for international flights only. So for you as a student pilot, m- you know, most of your flying as a private pilot, you probably won't use it, but maybe if you live near one of the borders, you might, look into getting a radio operator's license if you want to cross over the border or whatever. There's more that you got to look into to do that. But as a student pilot, not something you really want to worry about, but it is required if you want to do international flights. Next one is operating limitations. And here we have a picture of the pilot operating handbook, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the operating limitations are found in the current FAA approved flight manual. So approved flight manual, we call AFM. I kind of should have put that in there. Or pilot operating handbook, we call POH. So just the short acronyms for those two things. So they can also be found outside of the POH or AFM on the aircraft itself. So we kind of have some pictures here of what we're looking at. They can be found placarded onto the dashboard. So like here you see avoid slips with flaps extended. It's kind of placarded on here. Or this placard, it has more, as you can see, it says operating limitations, and it's got things about maximum gear operating speed, minimum control airspeed, and things like that. So they can be placarded on the actual dashboard. They can also be, and they are, found on the airspeed indicator. So this is the markings on an airspeed indicator are actually considered operating limitations. So the operating limitations, as we mentioned, that all these required documentation of aero has to be with you in the aircraft when you're operating it. And so that includes operating limitations. Some are found in the POH, so you got to take, or AFM, you got to take the POH or AFM with you. And then these ones that are placarded on or on an instrument are obviously going to be with you at all times. So what are the operating limitations on the airspeed indicator? We go over this in a different video in more detail, but these different kind of ranges of colors. So, the white arc is the flap operating range. So the range of speeds you can operate with flaps. The green is kind of the normal operating speed. The yellow is the caution range. And then the red is the never exceed speed. So those are obviously operating limitations that are right there on the airspeed indicator. All right, the next one is the weight and balance, also found in the FAA approved flight manual, AFM or POH. So what is the FAA approved flight manual or POH? We've mentioned it before. So what exactly is it for those of you that maybe haven't had a flight lesson yet or haven't seen one or are completely new to aviation? So every aircraft has an AFM or POH. They kind of basically serve the same purpose. And as mentioned, it contains important information such as operating limitations and the weight and balance information, which is required to be with you while operating the aircraft. It also has official specifications for the aircraft propeller and engine, which is very important. And then it also has performance tables or charts, equipment lists, and more information that pilots use nearly every flight. So throughout the ground school, you'll see different times where we're going to reference charts, tables, information from your aircraft's POH, and we'll use examples of kind of general example POHs or AFMs. But it's a document that you're going to be very familiar with and that you want to take with you every time you fly, and that should stay in the aircraft. When you go to like a flight training school or something, they make sure that it's kind of in the back seat, the pocket behind the seat is usually where they keep the AFM or POH at all times so that students can just access it each time, whoever is renting the aircraft at that time. Okay, so that's required aircraft documentation. I'm going to check out the chat to see if you guys have any questions on required aircraft documentation. So I'll give it just a couple minutes while I drink some water, or maybe 1 minute or so. If no one has a question, we'll move on. So far, this stuff is pretty much just rote memorization, just kind of remembering some rules and regulations. Not the most fun stuff to talk about, but things we need to know and remember as a student pilot and a private pilot. All right, well, give it another few seconds. If you have a question, it comes to you later, no worries, just put it in there. I'll answer some questions at the end as well. All right, so oh, I think I just saw one. Are you required to have the actual full POH with you when flying, or does a placard, like you said, technically count as having operating limitation with you? So the operating limitations, not all of them are going to be placarded on the aircraft. So they're also going to be found in the POH. It'll have a chapter on operating limitations. So you kind of have to have both. So yeah, you'll have to take it with you in the aircraft. Well, you at least have to have the arrow, right? So if you had some other form of the operating limitations with you and the weight and balance information with you, then technically, I guess you wouldn't have to take the pilot operating handbook or weight and balance. But you have to have that information, and it has to be valid and match what's in the Pilot Operating Handbook or AFM. Because that's what comes from the manufacturers. Okay. So they like flight tested all this stuff. They know the operating limitations based off the flight test. They know what the safe limitations of the aircraft. So that's kind of the controlling document. It also has information, which we'll get to later, about required equipment for different types of flight and things like that. So, yeah, you'll want to have that with you at all times when operating the aircraft. Good question. Okay, let's continue on. Required aircraft inspections. This is from FAR 91.409, which talks about inspections. So no person may operate a civil aircraft unless the following documents are within the aircraft. For this, we use the mnemonic 𝐏𝐢𝐥𝐸. So the only kind of nuance here is that this I is actually a 1, and we'll get to what these are. But this is probably the best mnemonic because it says aviates, right? And so it matches what we're doing, flying, being an aviator. So the A in aviates, the first A, stands for annual inspection. The V stands for VOR. The 1, remember that's a 1, stands for 100-hour inspection. The second A stands for the altimeter inspection. The T stands for transponder. The E stands for ELT, or emergency locator transponder. And the S stands for static and pitot system inspection. So let's go over kind of a little bit more information on each of these, starting with the first A of aviates, which is annual. So the annual inspection is required every 12 calendar months. That makes sense. It's an annual. It's required annually, so 12 calendar months. It's required for both visual flight rules and instrument flight rules, so VFR and IFR flight. Just real quick, if you don't know, maybe if you're just getting started, let's go over what VFR and IFR flight are. So VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules. It's a set of regulations allowing pilots to operate an aircraft in weather conditions clear enough to navigate and control the aircraft by visual reference to the ground and other obstacles without relying solely on instruments. So basically think of good weather flying as kind of VFR. And then instrument flight rules, or IFR, is a set of regulations allowing a pilot to operate an aircraft in weather conditions where navigation and control rely primarily on instruments rather than visual reference. So think of IFR as you can't rely on seeing out the windshield of your aircraft, so you have to focus and trust your instruments. So that's what IFR is. Think of that as kind of bad weather flying. Private pilots are only allowed to fly under VFR, but as a private pilot, we still need to know what inspections are required for each, because a lot of the aircraft we will fly will have equipment and inspections done for both VFR and IFR. So we're going to say which ones of these are required for both, and aviates includes ones inspections that are required for both VFR and IFR. All right, so one quick thing is I mentioned a calendar month. So a calendar month means that you get the whole month. So what's an example of that? So if your aircraft got an annual inspection on August 7th, 2024, then the next annual is not due until after August 31st, 2025. So it wouldn't be due August 7th, 2025. You get the rest of that month and then a year later, right? So let's kind of do an example. The way I think of it, I started the date the annual was done, so August 7th, 2024 here. And then you jump a year ahead, and then you just go to the end. So now we're looking at August 7th, 2025 here. And then you just go to the end of the month, which is August 31st. So that would be the last day that you can get your annual inspection before the aircraft is no longer airworthy. So that's what calendar month means. We'll talk about that more in more regulations. So it's important to kind of know what that means when they say calendar month. All right, so let's move on. The next one, the V in aviates, is for VOR. So we got a picture of a VOR instrument here. We'll talk about this more in the course later. It's required every 30 days, and it's required for IFR flight only. The next one is the 1 of aviates. Well, that's kind of acting like an I when we say aviates, is the 100-hour inspection. It's required every 100 hours of aircraft operation per the aircraft Hobbs meter. The Hobbs meter just kind of keeps track of the time that the aircraft engine is running. So every 100 hours that the aircraft engine is running, that's when the 100 hours due. It's only required for aircraft that are used for hire, and that includes both VFR and IFR flights. What is for hire? So one example of for hire would be hiring a pilot and his or her airplane to give you a tour on vacation. Another example would be a student pilot paying a flight instructor for instruction and the use of an airplane that is also owned by the flight instructor. So they generally say you're getting an aircraft for hire when you hire both the aircraft, like you're renting the aircraft, and you're renting, the pilot in command. So that's generally what they mean by as for hire. So private pilots are not allowed to fly for hire. However, an aircraft can still be used for hire even if the pilot operating the aircraft isn't receiving direct compensation. Therefore, aircraft still get 100-hour inspections in certain situations. So the aircraft you're likely to train in at your flight school or flight club or whatever, it's probably going to get that 100-hour done because they could still rent their aircraft for other purposes, like for hire. And, also 100-hour means you're getting more inspections on your aircraft, which is a good thing. Okay, a 100-hour inspection can be completed up to 10 hours after the hour it is due, if and only if the aircraft is flying to a place to get the inspection completed. So, what does this mean? Let's do an example. Say your last 100-hour inspection was completed with your Hobbs meter saying 1102.2. So, your aircraft engine has been running for 1102.2. You get a 100-hour inspection at that time. So your next 100-hour inspection would be due 100 hours from then. So 1102.2 plus 100 is 1202.2. So that's when it's due. But let's say you don't have a certified mechanic to perform this inspection at your airport. So you have to fly. Let's just say it's 10 hours away where you have to go. Likely there would be something closer, hopefully. But let's say you have to fly 10 hours away to an airport where the inspection gets done. Here you have taken advantage of the rule of getting up to 10 extra hours to fly if you need to fly somewhere to get it done. So you actually get your inspection done at 1212.2 on your Hobbs meter. So instead of getting it done when it was due, we take off, let's say at 1202.1, we fly 10 hours, and then we get it done at 1212.2. Okay, so according to the FARs, that is okay because we flew only if and only if, right? We flew to somewhere where that 100-hour was going to get done. All right, so the tricky part that students kind of get tripped up on is when would the next 100-hour be due? Would it be due 100 hours from this time, the 1212.2, or would it be done 100 hours from this time, the 1202.2? And the answer is it's 100 hours from the 1202.2. The FAA says that you must include the extra hours you overflew the last inspection date in your calculation. That wording is confusing to me. It means that you don't start your 100-hour timer when you actually got it done here at 1212.2. You don't restart here and get it done at 1312.2. You start it when it was due. So again, it was due here. So the new 100-hour clock starts here and you have to get it done again, 1302.2. So technically, it's only 90 hours between the times when your 100 hours were done, but the FAA doesn't care about that. An easy way to remember this is just to remember that no matter if you go over extra any hours or not, it's due 100 hours, every 100 hours of Hobbs time. So let's do it. 1102.2, 1202.2, 1302.2, 1402.2, and so on. All right, the next A in aviates is altimeter. Got a picture of an altimeter here. Again, we'll talk about this more in detail later in the course. This is required every 12 calendar months. Again, that's calendar months, so you get that the whole month. This is required for IFR flight only, which is kind of surprising. But again, the aircraft we fly are likely to maybe be getting this anyways, even if the aircraft isn't being used for IFR flight, or maybe it is. It's always good to get extra inspections, right? And you'll be able to see these inspections in your aircraft maintenance logbooks. The next one, the T in aviates, is for transponder. It's required every 24 calendar months as well. And it's not required whether it's IFR flight or VFR flight, but instead it's required in specific areas that you fly. And we have another video and a lesson where we go over this in detail, but it's required when you fly in a Mode C Vail, when you fly in class Alpha Bravo or Charlie airspace, or you fly above class Bravo or Charlie airspace, or you fly above 10,000 feet MSL. There's a couple more times when it's required, and again, we go over that in a different video. But that's when it's required to have a transponder. So if you're required to have a transponder in these flights, then you would be required to get the inspection every 24 calendar months. And finally, the E, so I guess not the last one because we got the S at the end of aviates, is for emergency locator transmitter, which is ELT. And it requires a functional check every 12 calendar months. And then it requires the battery to be replaced at half its used life or after an hour of cumulative use. So if it turns on and it's been used for half an hour one day and then another day gets turned on and used for a half hour, that would be an hour of cumulative use and you'd have to get the battery replaced. Or let's say it's never really used, but it reaches its half-life, then it would have to be replaced. The half-life will either be found in like the user guide for the ELT, or sometimes like right here on the side, it'll be printed on the side of the actual ELT itself, or maybe it's marked in like the maintenance logbooks for the aircraft. And this is required for both VFR and IFR flight. All right, finally, the S in aviates is the last one. It stands for static and pitot system. This is kind of a diagram of static and pitot system. Again, we go in detail in videos and lessons on the static and pitot system and the aircraft instruments that are a part of that in different lessons and videos. But just for the sake of inspections, this is required to be inspected every 24 calendar months. And it's only for IFR flight, which again is a bit surprising. I personally, even if I wasn't flying IFR, would want my static and pitot system to be inspected every 24 calendar months, if not more. So how do we check if inspections have been done on our aircraft? Because again, keeping an aircraft airworthy is up to the owner and operator of the aircraft, but we as private pilots, we have to make sure that the aircraft we're flying is airworthy. So we have to know, and when you're on your check ride, you'll have to know and prove that your aircraft is airworthy. So how do we check if inspections have been done in the correct amount of time that it's required? Well, certified mechanics will notate and sign the aircraft maintenance logs when the inspections are performed. So it's just like a flight pilot logbook, you'll have an aircraft logbook. Some aircraft will have one maintenance logbook, called like an aircraft log like this, and some will have two. It'll be like a power plant, not a PowerPoint, a power plant logbook, and then so that would be like for the engine. So one for the power plant, or AKA the engine, and then one for the airframe. But then some just have one. So you'll look through there, you'll see the date, maybe a note or two on what inspection was completed, if everything looked good, and then the signature and number of the certified mechanic who did that inspection. And you'll be able to say, okay, yeah, the static and pitot system was inspected, 20 months ago. That's within the 24 calendar months, so we're good there, and so on. You can check the annual, the 100-hour, and all those things will be noted, signed off in these logs. If you come across an aircraft engine or power plant logbook with no operating history, it is likely due to the aircraft having just received a new engine. Either that or you have the wrong logbook. But I put this in here because this is a question that we have been hearing. Could be possible question that you'll get from your examiner or maybe on the FAA written. So, if it has no operating history, what kind of situation might that be? Well, an aircraft can get a new engine, so it would have, a airframe logbook with a bunch of history, but the engine power plant logbook would have no history, and that's sometimes why they have two different maintenance logbooks for airframe and power plant. Okay, I'm going to see if you guys have any questions here. That was a little bit a longer one. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll give it a minute or so. before we move on to required equipment for your aircraft. Okay, any questions? All right. Well, we'll continue. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat as we continue on through. All right, let's talk about required aircraft equipment. This comes from FAR 91.205. The first one is from paragraph B of that FAR, and it describes required equipment for day VFR. Remember, that's Visual Flight Rules flight. And it says no person may operate a civil aircraft under VFR during the day unless it has installed and operational the following equipment. So the mnemonic we use for this is A tomato flames. It's a long one, and we'll go over what each of these is. The first A is the airspeed indicator. Then we have a temperature gauge, which is required for liquid-cooled engines. We have the oil pressure gauge. We have a magnetic compass, anti-collision lights, tachometer, oil temperature gauge, fuel gauges, landing gear position indicator, and this is for a retractable gear, so aircraft with retractable gear, altimeter, manifold pressure gauge, and this is for aircraft with altitude engines, and emergency locator transmitter or ELT, and seatbelts and harness. As you can see, not all of this equipment is required for every aircraft. For example, if your aircraft has an air-cooled engine instead of a liquid-cooled engine, then it does not require a temperature gauge. If it doesn't have retractable landing gear, then it obviously doesn't need a landing gear position indicator because that position indicator would just say the landing gear is down all the time. And if it doesn't have an altitude engine, then it doesn't need a manifold pressure gauge. Altitude engines are engines that kind of vary the different aspects of them to be more efficient at different altitudes. So most general aviation aircraft do not have liquid-cooled altitude engines or retractable gear. And because of this, I came up with my own mnemonic for equipment, 𝐏𝐤𝐥𝐸. And this is in the lesson, in the course. It's ACAFOOTSEA, which takes out those three components. So it takes out temperature gauge, landing gear position indicator, and manifold pressure gauge. However, A tomato flames that you see here is the most comprehensive and straight from the FARs. So this is best for students to first remember A tomato flames, and then you can tailor the list to the specific aircraft that you fly or are flying during flight training. So just know that A tomato flames is the most comprehensive, but some of these might not be on your aircraft or applicable to your aircraft operation, and therefore would not be required for your aircraft that you end up flying during flight training. All right, so now let's talk about 91.205 paragraph C, which describes required equipment for night VFR. So this is flying at night under visual flight rules. It says no person may operate a civil aircraft under visual flight rules or VFR during night unless it has installed and operational the following equipment. So this mnemonic, again, another good one that relates to aviation. This mnemonic is flaps. So the F stands for fuses or circuit breakers. L stands for landing light. A stands for anti-collision light. And if you're thinking, hey, I thought we already heard anti-collision light, you're right. We did. That was it's required for day flight. I think whoever came up with this mnemonic just reused it. One, because it's an important thing to have in your aircraft, as all these are. But two, they needed a vowel to have a good mnemonic device and make it a word like flaps. So that's why it is in both, but it is required for both day and night. By the way, everything required in the day is also required at night. So if you want to fly at night, you need everything in a tomato flames and everything in flaps. Uh, the P in flaps is position lights, and the S is a source of electricity. That would be like an alternator or our on our engine, or if we lose that, our battery as a backup. Okay, so let's talk about other required equipment. Your specific aircraft could have additional requirements for equipment that are not listed in the FARs. So they're not listed in tomato flames or flaps. Some aircraft, not usually general aviation trainer aircraft, but some aircraft, and usually bigger ones, like especially airliners, have a minimum equipment list or MEL, which dictates the minimum amount of equipment that must be installed and operational on an aircraft. So it makes sense because a lot of these like big airline, you know, Boeing aircraft, they have redundant systems. So they might have two or three or four of the same, you know, pump or something, and they need to have, three of those operational or something like that. So they need a big list that says, okay, this is the minimum equipment that you have to have installed and operational to be able to be airworthy. But general aviation trainer aircraft usually don't have an MEL. But if it did, it may list additional equipment that is required for that aircraft. Other equipment could be listed in the aircraft type certificate data sheet. So if you got type certified, it would list the specific equipment they would have to operate under that type certificate. And it might be something other than what was in FAR 91.205. A kinds of operation list. This is in the approved flight manual or POH. It might say, for example, if you want to fly above 8,000 feet MSL, that you also have to have, I don't know, I don't know what it would be, but you might have to have additional equipment. Or let's say the kinds of operation list says during slow flight, you have to have a angle of attack indicator or something like that. It would list the kind of operation. So not every type of flight, but a specific type of flight, you have to have a specific piece of equipment. That would be in the AFM or POH. And then airworthiness directives or ADs, which again, we have another video and lesson on ADs. So they might list specific equipment that perhaps, there's an issue with one piece of equipment. So you have to have a supplementing piece of equipment to be able to operate with the first piece of equipment. I don't know. I'm not really sure of an example of that, but I think it could happen in an airworthiness directives because ADs are an extension of the FARs for your specific aircraft if your aircraft has an AD. All right, so let's see if there are any questions before we continue. How does one verify a mechanic's entry? Well, the mechanic will sign off with their like FAA number. So just like as pilots, we have, you know, um, pilot numbers. I'm forgetting what the FAA tracking number, FTN, I think it is. Maybe that's or the certificate number, right? Your certificate number, not the tracking number, but they'll have a certificate number for their mechanical certificate, and so they'll put that with their signature. So, I mean, that's how you would verify that the person, um, that did the inspection is an actual certified mechanic. Any other questions? We got one more section, and then and then I could see if you guys have any other questions after that as well. All right. Um, Feel free to drop it in there, but I'm going to continue on. All right, so I want to talk about inoperable aircraft equipment and in particular flight with inoperable equipment. So what happens if you find a piece of equipment or instrument that is inoperable during the pre-flight check of your aircraft? Well, if the equipment is required, you can't fly. So let's say, right, the airspeed indicator isn't working. That was a part of A tomato flames. That was the first A. If that is not operable, then you can't fly until that gets fixed by a certified mechanic and returned, and the aircraft gets returned to service, then you would be allowed to fly it. So if it's required, you can't, and inoperable, you can't fly. So the first step is to determine if the equipment that's inoperable is required or not. So to do that, you want to check to see if the inoperable equipment is required. You would first check to see if the aircraft has an MEL, which you talked about, a minimum equipment list. Because if it does, this would be the controlling document for equipment. Again, most trainer general aviation aircraft do not have one of these. They're mostly for larger aircraft. If no MEL, check the type certificate data sheet, kinds of operation list, and airworthiness directives that we talked about for the aircraft. Finally, reference the 91205 A tomato flames, or if you're flying at night, flaps. If the equipment is not required by any of these, then you can still fly. However, before you fly, the inoperable equipment must first be repaired, be deactivated and placarded as inoperative, or completely removed from the aircraft. In each of these cases, these actions must be signed off in the aircraft maintenance logs by a mechanic. Only then is the aircraft legal to fly. And before passengers can be carried in an aircraft that has been altered in any manner that may appreciably change its flight characteristics, it must be flight tested by a pilot who holds at least a private pilot certificate. So in this one, we talk about may appreciably change the flight characteristics. A lot of the equipment wouldn't do that, right? Like an airspeed indicator wouldn't change the flight characteristics. So, but this is kind of along the lines of maintenance and things like that. So I decided to put it in here and something you might get asked on an exam or something like that. All right. Now I want to talk about a special flight permit. It's kind of related to inoperable equipment a little bit. But I just kind of wanted to throw that in here. It's kind of a short topic. So let's talk about special flight permits. A special flight permit may be issued to any U.S. registered aircraft that may not currently meet applicable airworthiness requirements, but is capable for safe flight. So examples might include an aircraft flying to a repair shop in a different state or a new aircraft being delivered to a new buyer. Test flying in an experimental aircraft is not a valid reason for a special flight permit. So you might be thinking, well, it's capable for safe flight, then why can't we just fly it like normal? Why do we have a special flight permit if we're saying it's safe? Well, there might be a piece of required equipment, right? Like say, for example, the airspeed indicator. I keep using that example, but it's a good example. The aircraft can still fly safe without an airspeed indicator, right? Your aircraft could have like a angle of attack indicator, a stall horn, all these other things. You could still, with your sight picture, if you fly in VFR and you have these other instruments and you have the attitude indicator, things like that, you can still fly it relatively safely if you lose the airspeed indicator. So the FAA may deem that it's still safe for you to fly to the location to get that fixed. And that would be an example of a special flight permit. All right, so that is what I have. Let's see if there's any questions on these topics or anything in general that you're seeing as you go through the course. Whatever you guys want. We got you know, depending on the questions, we can go up to 15 or so more minutes, 15, 20 more minutes. I guess it's 4:40. So yeah, 20 more minutes if you guys have questions for it. If not, no worries. We can end this early. As I mentioned, this has been recorded and we'll put this in the bonus course. So if you go to your student dashboard, you click on my courses, you look for the bonus downloads and video course. We have all the recorded live lessons in there for you to rewatch. We also have a bunch of bonus PDFs and things. We talk about that in the welcome email when people sign up, that bonus course. But a lot of people never go check it out. It's got a lot of good stuff in there. So be sure to go check out that bonus course. What is this? There we go. All right, we got a question here. I have a question about the in-op placarding. My CFI told me if you find a piece of equipment that is not required for a day for VFR day night use by a tomato flame flaps or an MEL or the PH, etc., you could just placard it as an op and you are all set. If this is true, or does it have to be done by a mechanic? So the FAR says that it has to be, so this is actually not true. Um, that is not good. I think there's a chip. I think you keep marking up the page here. I don't know if you can turn that off. Um, I don't know how to turn people's markings off. Anyways. Um, sorry. So yeah, that's actually not true. You have to have it, as we see here, it has to be deactivated and placarded as an inoperative. So can anybody think of why we can't just like let's say it's a light. Let's say it's a landing light, right? And it's not working. So we flip the switch on, it doesn't turn on. But we're not flying at night. Landing light is required at night. We're not flying at night, so no big problem. We'll just put an op sticker like this over the landing light sticker and we're good to go, right? No, we have to it has to be deactivated. So why does the FAA care? Why do we have to deactivate it? Does anybody know why that's important? It's because we just marking it inoperative assumes that pretty much the only problem is the switch, right? Or there's not something like a loose wire that could be sparking. We don't really know what the exact problem is. We just know that the landing light is not working. So if we just, say that it's an op, it could still be like a loose wire that could cause like a fire or something, or it could short out other important, instrumentation or something. It could be a more complex problem that and that's why we need to deactivate it completely. And that's why it needs to be done by a mechanic. Good question. Any other questions? So next time, and I want to do this soon, maybe next week. So be on the lookout for the next live lesson. We're gonna do the airworthiness directives. We kind of mentioned what an AD or airworthiness directive is. Then we'll talk about minimum safe altitudes, and then probably ATC clearance and compliance. Probably those. Minimum safe altitudes is a bit of a longer one. Maybe one more. And then after that, we'll do probably, fuel requirements, hemispherical rule, TFRs. Those are pretty short. Scuba diving short, flight planning short. Uh, yeah, probably two more after that. But that's kind of what we have coming up in this series of live lessons. And then like we're doing now, if you have any questions, you can bring those and we can get to them at the end. But uh, if you have any questions, before that, and you don't want to wait for the live lessons, be sure to just email us, team@parttimepilot.com, or you can message us on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok even, wherever you do social medias. We're pretty active on those. And then the best is the email. We try to get back to you as soon as possible, unless we're sleeping or something. But the Facebook group as well, if you're not in the Facebook study group, that's really valuable. Just search part-time pilot, private pilot study group, in Facebook. And then that's the best place to ask a question. Um, just because we'll answer you. We always make it a point to answer the people that ask questions in there, but you'll also get an answer from other students who maybe have already been through it or maybe have a different perspective, another CFI or, you know, experienced pilot who has a different way of explaining it. And sometimes, there's some tricky subjects in becoming a pilot, and sometimes just hearing it a few different ways will finally help it click. Or maybe, a certain way for you works better than how I do it. I'll definitely try and explain it multiple ways if you're not getting it until you do get it. But that's the power of that group kind of learning thing. All right. Any other questions you guys have? Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for joining. Good questions, and glad you liked it. And yeah. All right, everybody. Have a good one, and reach out if you have any questions.